The fragments will allow Mystery Quest to perform the world's first DNA analysis of the skull.
What we'll do at this point now is to take all of the photographic evidence we have, the samples we have taken, along with the information of the cranium that we have, and we'll bring these all back to the United States and do some laboratory analysis to see what we can extract that may help us with this mystery.
Mystery Quest is searching Europe for answers about the mysterious death of Adolf Hitler. Christoph Neubauer is leading the expedition in Berlin. He does not believe the eyewitness accounts of Rochus Misch and others are true. He's gathering evidence to test their stories below ground. During the war, the Germans built a massive network of bunkers and tunnels under Berlin. Some are still accessible today, virtually unchanged. Neubauer meets underground expert Sascha Keil. Structural details like corridor length, wall thickness, and acoustics will allow him to create the most realistic model. Their first stop should provide information about the materials and construction of walls.
That gives me actually an indication how Hitler's bunker could have actually been structured.
In one room, they discover a large generator.
Is this the original one?
Yeah, completely. 100% and it's still in function after so many decades. It's the last one remaining on these engines.
The same model generated power for the Führer bunker.
We're now in the cellar, and this is an emergency shaft going from the cellar to the roof. And you can climb up totally to the roof.
Okay. This is actually very interesting because the Russian reports say that we had exactly such an emergency exit into the bunker. From there you could actually come into the garden.
The emergency hatch shows how Hitler could have escaped from his study.
I need to target something first. I need to get closer.
Dr. Nick Bellantoni is also now in Germany. He's traveled here from Moscow, hoping to examine the site where Hitler is thought to have been buried. In 1946, a Russian covert unit called Smersh is said to have moved Hitler's corpse an hour southwest from Berlin to a military base in Magdeburg. Smersh, which in English means death to spies, was founded during the war to keep the Red Army free of traitors, deserters, and spies. But after the war, Stalin used Smersh to find out what had happened to Adolf Hitler. The account of the investigation is part of the Operation Mid-Files Bellantoni was able to examine in Moscow. Smersh allegedly found Hitler's charred corpse at the bunker on May 4th, 1945. Then buried it in Magdeburg, where it remained undisturbed until 1970, when the Russians decided to destroy it once and for all.
This renovated residence that we're standing in front of was actually officers' quarters for the Russian army in the late 1940s. And it was here that Adolf Hitler was buried until 1970. So we're hoping to take a look at the land, see the area where the former courtyard used to be, and see if we can find any physical evidence of where the burials might have been located.
Bellantoni is led to the area where the bodies are believed to have been buried.
see, the land has been overgrown, land use, much of the stuff that's happened here, the root system, we're really not going to, our investigation will not yield.
Russian records show that Hitler's body was taken 10 miles from Magdeburg and then cremated in front of a morgue. Bellantoni hopes to find cremated bone fragments to corroborate that the skull in Moscow is real. But the location is not marked. And the only clue is an article from a local archive containing a photo of the place.
We're just coming from the archive, and they've led us to this general area of the Soviet camp. Unfortunately, they only have one article that was of use to us, but what is important here is that that article's photograph is helpful in hopefully finding out where on this property the crematory was located. We're going to have to use this photograph like a detective would. I could see a tower, a field, and a grove of trees. The tower and field really come into perspective. The legs on the tower are too wide apart from this perspective compared to what's in the photograph. So we still got to go further, but clearly we're on the right trail. Look at this. A slab. We've got a cement slab over here. This is it. This is it. This is the morgue. According to the eyewitness account, Adolf Hitler's final cremation was out here in the front of the morgue, probably about where I'm standing.
Bellantoni begins digging a test pit 10 feet from where the front of the building used to be. He's looking for bone fragments to compare against the skull fragments from Russia.
We're not seeing much for artifacts.
No bone is found, but samples from the different layers of the pit are taken for chemical analysis. Bellantoni has gathered the evidence necessary to test the Russian account of Hitler's death.
Our studies have been basically exploratory, but clearly this has the potential of yielding more information.
Mystery Quest is investigating what happened to Adolf Hitler at the end of World War II. For decades, speculation has raged that Hitler escaped Germany and lived out his days plotting revenge. The Russians, who claim they discovered his body, have changed their account of what happened numerous times. Now, Mystery Quest has been given access to the physical evidence the Russians say proves Hitler did die in his bunker. Dr. Nick Bellantoni is back in the U.S. to test the blood, skull, and soil samples collected from Europe.
I don't have a target.
The science team begins by looking for traces of Hitler's bones from his reported burial site in Germany.
I have a couple of samples from Germany for you. It might be what we're looking for.
But the soil does not reveal any traces of human remains that can be compared against the skull fragments to confirm they are Hitler's. Bellantoni next performs a forensic examination of the high-resolution images he took of the skull. He's noticed something.
Well, upon our return from Russia, one of the things we wanted to do was take a look at our photographs and we had blow them up and really see if we really get some good detail on top of the forensic information we achieved there. A few things that are pretty striking here and actually problematic. One thing we had noticed in Russia, and really are highlighted here in these photographs, are the sutures are very open. And what the sutures are, if I can use this model, are basically where the various skull plates come together. You get this sort of jigsaw line where the bones come together. And really what happens, basically, as you get older, they start obliterating. We know Hitler died at 56 years of age. Really quite open in some of that age bracket. These look very young, like a more someone who's 20 years old.
And there's something even more striking about this piece of skull.
The other thing that we noted also in Russia, we see here very much in the thinness of the wall, but it's rather small. And as a result, it's something we would not expect from an adult male. Usually males are more robust. If the police brought us this, we would have thought it was a woman, to be honest with you.
This could mean that the skull the Russians have held for decades isn't Hitler's at all. The DNA tests on the skull fragments and sofa should prove more definitively whether the skull is Hitler's. Those tests are being conducted at the University of Connecticut Center for Applied Genetics.
How may I aid you?
Director Linda Strasbaugh will oversee the attempt to extract DNA from the samples. It will be difficult due to the age and condition of the samples.
The fragments are badly charred, and this is the forensic scientist or historic DNA scientist's worst nightmare. It's one of the biggest challenges for getting DNA from burnt pieces of bone. The pieces are very small, and we just aren't certain how much luck we're going to have in coaxing DNA out of these samples. We'll be taking extreme caution with these samples. We'll be using full forensic procedures to avoid contamination.
They begin by soaking the samples overnight in a special chemical solution. If the process is successful, the science team will be one step closer to determining whether the skull and sofa fragments really contain Hitler's DNA. The next morning, the team removes the samples from the roller and the bone fragments are ground into a fine powder.
For the bone fragments, we actually powder the bone to make it easier for the solution to get in and lift the DNA out.
To their surprise, the team succeeds in identifying viable DNA in both the skull and sofa samples.
Wow, you got something. A bone fragment. I'm really surprised at that. And a swab, goodness.
They will now isolate and replicate the DNA through a process called molecular copying. This will give the scientists more material to look at. The analysis will potentially call into question all conventional beliefs about Hitler's death.
Looking at the bone, that was a possibility, but I never really imagined that it really would come out this way. Wow.
Mystery Quest has undertaken an expedition to Eastern Europe to try to determine whether Adolf Hitler died in 1945 or somehow escaped. This man, a former Nazi bodyguard, insists he saw Hitler and Eva Braun dead in a Berlin bunker. This author believes Hitler faked his death and escaped to Argentina. This scientist is testing the only known physical evidence of Hitler's body. In Berlin, Christoph Neumann is unveiling his animated reconstruction of the bunker. He is using it to test the accuracy of eyewitness Rochus Misch. This was the garden of the Reich Chancellor, under which the bunker was located. The upper level is where most of the staff was positioned. Hitler lived one level down. This is the door to his private quarters. Neubauer doubts the claim of Misch that he saw or heard Hitler die.
It appears that in the main bunker, that the engine was right next to it. They had the submarine diesel engine running, which is very loud. We have proof that you could not hear this engine running outside the rooms. So there it gives us an indication how protective actually such walls were. There's no way he could have heard anything.
And neither could anyone in the upper bunker, where most of the other eyewitnesses were.
The upper bunker was almost 4 meters apart and also 2 meters higher than its back. No way that anyone could anything there. No.
The accepted historical report of Hitler's death appears based on unreliable eyewitness evidence. Now, the analysis of the science team will be vital in determining whether the rest of the Russian account is true. Dr. Nick Bellantoni doesn't think the skull the Russians say is Hitler's is really his. He says the areas where the skull plates come together indicate the skull belongs to someone much younger than Hitler would have been at the time of his death, and they even belong to a female. The team was able to extract something called allosomal DNA from the skull and blood evidence. This reveals a person's gender.
In females, there are 2 sex chromosomes of the X variety. A male has 1 X and 1 Y as his sex chromosomes. The red boxes tell us what the computer says is there.
First, the team looks at the DNA results from blood on the sofa.
The blood sample contains predominantly male DNA.
So the blood on the sofa came from a man. But whether it actually belongs to Hitler can't be proven without a DNA sample from a relative. While Hitler has living relatives in the U.S., they did not respond to inquiries from Mystery Quest. The team turns to the DNA result from the skull.
So the sample, which came from the skull, has only a female signature in it. And so we think that's come from a woman.
So you're saying the bone fragment came
The
from
bone fragment.
a woman, a female?
The skull of a female.
Wow. And you're absolutely positive about this?
As sure as we can be.
Wow.
Mystery Quest has uncovered groundbreaking new evidence that calls into question the historical account of the death of Adolf Hitler. The expedition team using 3D cameras proved that the eyewitness accounts of stories are underlined and probably wrong. The science team gained access to the skull Russia has long held definitive proof Hitler did die in his bunker. Discovered is in fact a woman. These astonishing facts may open a whole new chapter in history, leaving us with a larger mystery.
We're going to change everybody's stuff. That's not what we do. What happened to Hitler and others? in that buffer. If this is not, who is it? As a result of that, we've got a lot more homework to charge.
I need to target something first.
The following program presents theories about an historical event that is shrouded in mystery. It contains archival footage, reenactments, and dramatizations, which invite you, the viewer, to draw your own conclusions. April 1945. As Allied forces liberate Nazi concentration camps, the world gets its first glimpse of the horrors wrought by Adolf Hitler's regime. At Nuremberg, the Allies prosecute leading Nazi officials for these crimes against humanity. Some of the most dangerous war criminals are brought to justice.
There's a myth about Nazis, and that is that these horrible disappear. That simply isn't true.
The truth is that thousands of former Nazis, some of whom committed atrocities, went to work for the United States government without the public's knowledge. During the war, their crimes ranged from overseeing slave trade, sending orphans to their deaths.
I don't have a target.
After the war, they were on the U.S. payroll, either as scientists in America or as intelligence agents in Europe.
The U.S. government was willing to use mass murderers, was willing to protect them from justice, was willing to hide their activities from the American people.
Government documents, declassified in the late 1990s, indicate that many of the former Nazis of the U.S. and Europe misrepresented and fabricated intelligence. Some even worked as double agents for the Soviet Union. But some say this secret U.S. strategy, even with its flaws, was the only way to win the Cold War.
It is a duplicitous double game. You have to do that sometimes to advance a higher cause.
It was U.S. policy to hire whomever could provide useful information, regardless of whether they were a war criminal or not.
How far did the U.S. government go to cover up the wartime records of these recruits? And nearly 60 years later, does the American public know the whole truth?
They can claim that they turned over everything, but we have to trust the government to believe that.
It was a scandal. It was one of the great scandals of modern American intelligence history.
Germany, spring 1945. The Allies are on the verge of crushing the Nazi war machine. For many of Hitler's elite officers, self-preservation has become their top priority.
It was only in the last couple of months of the war that members of the SS started to approach Americans with offers of assistance. And it was clear they were doing it because the writing was on the wall, the war was over.
Among those carefully considering their predicament, 43-year-old General Reinhard Gehlen.
Reinhard Gehlen was a general staff officer. He was, by the end of the war, a major general in the German army. He was directly responsible for the German army's analytical group that studied the Soviet army.
General Gehlen knows better than most that the end is near. With the Eastern Front collapsing, he has been giving the Fuhrer consistently grim news for months.
As he foresaw the end, he began telling Hitler the truth about what the situation was in the East, and Hitler didn't want to hear it.
On April 9th, 1945, Gehlen is dismissed from his post by Hitler. Later that month, he quietly assembles his closest advisors to execute his post-war strategy.
He said, what we're going to do is we're going to get our files, all of our most valuable files from the Soviet Union, we're going to make copies of them, and we're going to bury them in different places.
He was an honest good guy.
And he did this in order to have a bargaining chip that he could use with the Western Allies later.
He accurately understood that an ideological showdown between East and West was evolving. And he positioned himself in such a way as to take advantage of that.
With his Nazi intelligence files safely hidden in the Bavarian mountainside, Galen turns himself in to American authorities on May 22, 1945, 2 weeks after his country's surrender. He grandly announces to his captors that he can provide unique intelligence on the Soviets to the American government. But it isn't until he is interrogated by a young Army captain that officials realize the significance of their captive.
A self-starter named Captain John Boker identifies Reinhard Galen in an interrogation center. He understood that the interests of the United States and the Soviet Union were not the same, and he felt that the time was absolutely right to use and to absorb whatever the Germans knew about the Soviets.
For months, Boker has interrogated captured German officers. From them, he has learned what many in the upper echelons of the U.S. government already know. Despite his past promises, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin's desire to spread communism throughout Europe is insatiable. So when General Galen emphasizes a gathering Soviet threat to the West, Captain Boker readily agrees.
Galen was a master at playing on our fears about the Soviet Union. Yes, he told Boker exactly what Boker expected to hear, which is that the Soviets were a great menace, that their desire for land was inexhaustible, and that he, Galen, was an expert on this new threat.
Within months of his surrender, the information Galen buried in the Alps is retrieved. While American intelligence analysts pore over his files, officials at the Pentagon decide to bring Galen and his officers to the United States. August 14, 1945. The Japanese surrender unconditionally. World War II is over. 10 days later, Galen and members of his staff are smuggled into the U.S., disguised as American civilians.
This would have been a political disaster if it had been known, because the general feeling would have been, indeed, that we'd taken out a bunch of Nazis. And this was a time when we just wanted to string them up. And here we were on the side, working with this German general.
Galen insists he never joined the Nazi Party, but he is well aware that his role as a general in the Third Reich may subject him to indictment at Nuremberg. So upon his arrival at Fort Hunt, Virginia, General Galen sets about reinventing himself for his new American colleagues.
When he was at Fort Hunt, he was creating this legend about himself. As he really was, he was not really a Nazi. He was just someone who was a pure spy technician who, at this stage of the game, is an ardent anti-communist who happened to be a very skillful espionage expert who just wanted to work for the cause.
According to author Christopher Simpson, however, Galen did more than gather intelligence. The former general is responsible for the brutal treatment of Soviets in Nazi POW camps.
You had interrogators under Galen's authority, interrogating the people in camps, and also offering them the choice of life or death. In other words, if you cooperate with and give us the intelligence you need, we'll give you some food. And if you don't cooperate, we won't, and you'll die.
Even as U.S. officials consider what to do with Hitler's henchmen, Galen quickly learns that increasing Soviet aggressions in Eastern Europe have already enhanced his value.
The thinking about Galen shifts in this period. The Cold War makes it shift. Stalin makes a number of very threatening moves. in 1945 and 46 that shakes up the debate about the future of U.S.-Soviet relations.
We suddenly realized these guys are not trustworthy at all, and that frightened us badly.
In the end, Washington's decision in 1945 to work with Galen is made out of an urgent need for spies who could provide solid intelligence about the Soviet Union.
Most of the experts from that time, I've interviewed a number of them, agree that the files were essentially empty concerning Eastern European and Soviet affairs.
As a result, the U.S. abruptly shifts from hunting key Nazis to courting them.
On the one hand, you had units of the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps doing their job, tracking down Nazi war criminals. On the other hand, you had other units of the same organization recruiting them to work against the Soviet Union.
When I arrived in Austria, my NCO, when I reported to him for duty, on the wall was a chart, automatic arrest categories of the Nazi Party and its affiliates. If you ran into these people, you were supposed to arrest them. And I said to him, I said, Izzy, what about this? He said, forget about it. We're after the communists now.
In the summer of 1946, Reinhard Gehlen returns to Germany. Hitler's former general is now working for the United States. His orders? Recruit agents who can gather fresh information on the Soviets. Almost all of the operatives Gehlen recruits are former Nazis. Some are known war criminals, and all are now on the U.S. payroll.
What Gehlen wanted to do was get as big, as fast as he could, because he knew that his survival depended on it.
Gehlen is now the primary U.S. source of intelligence about the Soviet Union based in Germany. Can a former Nazi general be trusted? It's a question that will haunt U.S. intelligence for years to come. In the meantime, U.S. officials will begin another secret alliance with former Nazis.